We saw last time how meiosis produced haploid gametes. We're going to now talk about how that feeds into sexual reproduction and how this all feeds into evolution. We're going to look at various different kind of possible ways that this functions in terms of producing evolutionary advantageous offspring. So what's the benefit of sexual reproduction? Not all organisms do it, so it clearly isn't the only solution, but it is one, and it's pretty successful. And then we'll talk about three different type of life cycles. We'll talk about human animal life cycle, we'll talk about plants, and a little bit about fungi for some sexually reproducing multicellular organisms. There are, of course, sexually reproducing single-celled organisms as well, but they have even more complicated sexual stages that are something that's quite interesting. If you want to take microbiology, we talk about those. So what's the advantage of sexual reproduction? It's really down to genetic variability. It increases genetic variability. But there are many downsides to sexual reproduction. It can be problematic. Different groups of organisms deal with these problems differently, but one of the big disadvantages is you need to find a mate. Now, we've talked about plants. Plants have both male and female organs, so they're kind of got the male and female right there, so that solves some of that problem. But having sexual reproduction with yourself does not really increase genetic variability a whole lot. It does a little bit, but not a ton. There is a chance that your offspring, the result of this genetic variability, are less suited to the environment they will be selected against. So you think about a bacteria that's growing along. If it has a mutation that allows it to grow well, it's going to pass that on to all of its offspring because it's reproducing clonally. If you're a sexually reproducing organism, you're throwing stuff out there and seeing what sticks, kind of, so to say. So there's a chance that your offspring are less suited to the environment. We see key timing between the seasons and sexual reproduction, so we got to make sure that that's synced up in order for our offspring to be produced at a proper time for them to survive and then go on to reproduce themselves. So when we look at animals, at least mammals, chordates as well, things with a backbone, right, and a spinal cord, we're almost entirely seeing sexual reproduction in there. Many other organism groups, though, use a combination of sexual reproduction with other possible systems that are in there. So the animal system is what we tend to think of, but there are more possibilities out there. So let's focus on the genetic variability side of things first. Why do we want to keep changing things? Well, there's a hypothesis that is called the Red Queen hypothesis. This goes to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And here we have the Red Queen who says, you just have to keep running to stay in the same place. It's kind of like that, right? You have to keep changing and evolution keeps functioning. It is a constant thing to just stay surviving, right? So you're constantly in a race for survival. You get some sort of new innovation, but then your competitors get a new innovation. So all organisms are co-evolving. They're evolving together. Predators will evolve, and then the prey will evolve, and then the predators will evolve. If they don't do that, somebody's going to go extinct, right? And then that's problematic. We've seen lots of extinctions throughout the history of the Earth. There were dinosaurs. No longer are dinosaurs, right? Whatever caused that asteroid, climate change from that asteroid, things like that, that led to the dinosaurs going extinct. We see remnants of them in birds and things like that, but very, very different today than they were. The tiny little mammal things that were living under their feet then came to take over, and maybe one day we will go extinct as well and something else will take over. So we're constantly trying to increase reproductive fitness. We'll talk more about this fitness term as we go on, but fitness in biology, the definition, is not how much you can lift or how far you can run. Fitness is the ability to produce more reproductively viable offspring relative to others within your species. So it's basically you can have more offspring and they're better capable of having offspring as well. That's all fitness is in biology. That's really what evolution is operating on. So to achieve that, right, it takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place, to keep up with the neighbors, basically. So sexual reproduction is enabling rapid changes in that genetic material, in the combinations of genes that are in there. So the sexual life cycle, like I said, meiosis is key to that. We have recombination, independent assortment, producing the gametes, which will then fuse. So meiosis and fertilization will alternate in animals. In animals, the dominant life phase is the multicellular diploid phase. That's the one that occupies most of the time. And indeed, the sperm and the egg are not a free-living generation. They will die outside of the multicellular diploid. That's not the case for all animals, but for most mammals, that is indeed the case. The germ cells in here, in the testes and the ovary, they produce our special cells, the gametes, through meiosis. So we produce the haploid gametes through meiosis in animals. The sperm and the egg are made by meiosis. Why am I being so specific here? Because it's not the same in all organisms. Fertilization then involves producing a single cell that is called the zygote, and that is diploid. That will then divide by mitosis to produce the multicellular diploid stage. All right, hopefully none of this is shocking to you. Hopefully you're well acquainted with the animal life cycle. Let's talk about some different things that might be a little strange to you. Start with fungi. Fungi are interesting. Fungi have a very different life cycle than you. They have both diploid and haploid phases. They actually don't spend a lot of time in the diploid phase. They spend a lot of their life in the haploid phase. And instead of having male or female, they produce what we call plus or minus mating types. So they have a multicellular haploid body, and then they produce either these plus or minus mating types. The cells of those can fuse for sexual reproduction. The zygote that is produced actually undergoes meiosis and makes structures called spores. So they can also make spores asexually through mitosis as well. Let's look at this and try to break it down a little bit. Okay, we have the haploid phase on the bottom here. The haploid phase, we can produce spores because it's haploid by mitosis. So we can make these spores, and those spores can go out and will create a new multicellular haploid organism. They can asexually reproduce in this cycle here. They produce the spores by mitosis, and those go out and create new what we call hyphae. Okay, these hyphae can either be plus type or minus mating type. Occasionally, these hyphae will interact with one another, and we will have a nuclear fusion that occurs. Okay, so the nucleus of a plus type fuses with the nucleus of a minus type, and we get what's called the zygospore. This is a sexual stage. It is diploid now, and it can undergo meiosis, which will then create new haploid cells, which can create their own spore, and the cycle continues. If that's confusing, that's because that's like way different than how our life is, right? We are multicellular diploids. They are multicellular haploids, and very rarely do they become diploid, only for that sexual stage. So almost the complete opposite of how our life cycle is functioning. Plants, on the other hand, have an even different system. Plants have what's called the alternation of generations. We will see that this name is very apt in a moment, because plants are going to alternate between a multicellular diploid phase and a multicellular haploid life phase. Plants, it's really critical to note that plants produce their gametes, their sperm and egg, by mitosis because they already have a multicellular haploid phase, what we call the gametophyte. So let's look at the cycle here, the alternation of generations. We have the haploid phases on the bottom, the diploid phases on the top. Here we're looking at a fern. It varies slightly between different lineages of plants. The mosses primarily focus on the bottom stage. That's their dominant life phase. As we progress from the mosses to the ferns into the gymnosperms and then the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants, this diploid phase becomes more and more dominant. But let's look at this fern here. Okay, let's look at what we know. The sporophyte is the multicellular diploid phase. That's the fern that you see sitting in the forest. On the bottom side of the fern fronds, we have these sori that produce spores. Okay, what are spores? Well, spores are produced by meiosis. So these cells go through meiosis and produce these haploid cells called spores. Now you'll notice there's not a male and a female version, not a sperm and an egg. Don't worry, that comes later. The spores will germinate, and that means they'll start dividing by mitosis. So you have this spore that is 1N haploid, and it starts dividing into a multicellular 1N structure, a multicellular haploid phase that is completely free living. This is called the gametophyte. Okay, so let's think about that. That is like your cells that are produced by meiosis, either sperm or egg. They divide by mitosis and they go and live their own life. That seems strange to us, but that's how plants do this. These gametophytes produce structures that will either produce sperm or egg. Now you'll notice these are the gametes, the sperm and the egg here. The gametes are produced by mitosis because we're already haploid, so we can't go through meiosis again. So we're producing our gametes by mitosis. The sperm and the egg will fuse to form a diploid zygote, which will divide by mitosis and produce a new sporophyte, the diploid multicellular stage. So that's one of the ways that plants can go through reproduction. Plants can also reproduce asexually, right? You're probably aware that you can cut bits off plants, stick them in the ground or stick them in some water. They'll create new roots and you get other new organisms. They're genetically identical. That's asexual reproduction, but plants can do both sexual and asexual reproduction. They can have sexual reproduction with themselves or with another organism of their species. Plants are very, very versatile in their ability to reproduce. All right, let's do a review question before we finish this chapter. So what is the ploidy of a gamete? Go ahead and pause the video. Think about this. The ploidy of a gamete is haploid. Now, for us, we're going to think of that as 1N because in all our examples, we're going to focus on diploid multicellular organisms with haploid gametes that are 1N. Technically, though, and not to confuse you, haploid means half ploidy. So in plants, we have this phenomenon called polyploidy, where plants can be 4N or 8N, or I've seen 32N. Technically, their haploid gametes would be half of that, and then they would recapitulate their full ploidy at the end. But for us, we're going to focus on a diploid-haploid interaction there. So haploid would be the ploidy of a gamete, and for us, that'll be 1N. All right, so sexual reproduction. Its goal is to increase genetic variability. There are some drawbacks there, right? So many organisms have methods of asexual reproduction as backup. We talk about plants, right? It's really hard to go out and find a new mate if you're a plant. You're kind of stuck where you are, right? So plants can have sex with themselves, but they can also reproduce asexually by creating new runners that go off and become a new organism or things like that. A life cycle is the sequence of events in the development of an organism and the production of cells that produce offspring. So that's real vague because, as we saw, life cycles can be very, very different. We didn't even touch on single-celled eukaryotes, which do really weird sexual stages. Animal life cycles alternate between meiosis to create haploid gametes and fertilization, which generates that diploid zygote, which then goes by mitosis to become the multicellular diploid phase. Fungi are primarily multicellular haploid, and the zygote quickly undergoes meiosis in that short sexual stage to make haploid spores. So they're very rarely diploid. Plants, on the other hand, have the alternation of generations, where we go between multicellular diploid free-living organism and multicellular haploid free-living organism. That is the alternation of generations there. Plants produce gametes by mitosis, since the gametophyte, the multicellular haploid phase, is already haploid. All right, that is it for chapter 11.